welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, classical podcast put on by classical educators. This is Thomas Magby, joined, as always, by Mr. A.J. Hannenberg.
That's me.
And Mr. Graeme Donaldson.
Hoi hoi.
Hoi hoi?
Hoi hoi.
What is that?
Oi.
I'm not helping.
That didn't answer the question.
I think wait, hold on. Hey, so today, Graeme Donaldson, you're going to be talking to us a little bit about Romanticism.
That's right.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a strange thing to have on a classical education podcast, because in many ways, Romanticism is almost the opposite of classicism. Or the Romantic movement of the 19th century, which we're going to be talking about, was something that was was opposed to, if you wanted to call it, the end of the Enlightenment, or rationalism, or neoclassicism, as it's often called. So Romanticism is a sort of reactionary movement to the Enlightenment. Anyway, so yes, it's maybe a little strange to have in a classical podcast, because Romanticism was undoing a lot of the things that the classical education had grown into, classical movement had grown into Europe throughout the Enlightenment. But anyway, we'll get there. And this is also a really big catch-all. This is, to call something romantic, or to call something from Romanticism, is this huge catch-all. We're really only going to be talking about a small, narrow area of Romanticism, and one that C.S. Lewis himself really grabbed hold to and used to talk about his own conversion and just sort of the natural world. There's different kinds of Romanticism conversations you can have. The continental Romanticism, like in Germany, was called Romanticism because it was a move back to the Middle Ages. So a move away from the world of Greece and Rome to be looking at, to rediscovering the heritage of the Middle Ages, the romance of chivalry, which is why it was called Romanticism. And then Romanticism in England, which we're going to be talking a lot about, was in reaction to industrialism and the embrace of the individual genius. But the way that I talk about this with our kids, with our students, is to talk about the experience that a lot of the poets who wrote Romantic poetry had of the natural world. And it's kind of almost like even an uncomfortable thing to talk about, because there's this human phenomena. C.S. Lewis was convinced that all people felt this. The Romantic poets write as if all people have felt this. But there's kind of these experiences that one can have in their life where they just have this transcendental moment of beauty, where something that is normally, commonly mundane and ordinary seems to hit you in full force, and you have this moment where, like, time stops and the world feels drenched in being more real, and there is this feeling of, the way that C.S. Lewis describes it, it's this feeling of contentment. This is what I wanted. But then also this feeling of extreme longing. There's this more real out there that I want, that I don't have, and my heart sort of longs for it.
Wasn't the longing sort of the byproduct of having the feeling, but having it only briefly?
It fade away.
And it fades away, and then you think, how can I keep this? How can I stay in this?
That's right. So in the moment, it's sort of this moment of the soul feeling like it's at home. And then it fades, and then you have this intense longing to have that back again. And there's different terms for it, and different poets talk about it in different ways. There's like a German word for it that Lewis uses in his own autobiography. But the term that we use for it in English class, just to give it some sort of shorthand term, is one that all kids who go through my 10th grade class are familiar with, and we just call it deep joy.
Did you get that phrase from somewhere?
I got it from Milton, who talks about the deep joy of Eden. And Lewis himself makes reference to calling it the deep joy of Eden. And so, just for lack of a better term, so we all know what we're talking about, I've just called it deep joy. If you Google deep joy, if you go deep joy romanticism, you're not going to find anything. But this is just sort of my term to talk about this phenomenon.
Transcendental experience.
A transcendental experience of beauty. But that's sort of like for 10th graders. So we just call it deep joy.
Yeah.
So if you're familiar with C.S. Lewis's own biography, he felt this when he was a young child. He was sick in bed, and his brother, to cheer him up, brought him a mason jar lid that he had turned upside down, filled with moss, and made a tiny little like forest, and gave it to Lewis to try to cheer him up. And Lewis, when he got this, he just sort of had this strong joy and desire. Like he just wanted to live in that tiny, perfect little garden on the lid. He just wanted to be small and fill this little mossy, damp, green place and just live there in this pastoral beauty. And his heart just longed for this sort of thing. Later in life, Lewis was walking the halls of his boarding school, I think, and he passed by an English class, and he heard somebody reading poetry out loud, and he didn't know the poet, and he didn't know anything about the story, and all he heard was somebody say, "Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead." And Lewis didn't know who Balder the Beautiful was, but he recognized that it was coming from Norse mythology, because he'd sort of heard about Balder before. But he said just in passing that classroom and hearing that line of poetry read, he just wanted to go to that world. He just wanted to go live in the world of Vikings and gods and ships and snow and north and know who Balder was and why did he die. And he just sort of had this moment of longing to go to a different place. You can see this pop up in his Narnia books, right? Lewis, in fact, actually dedicated his life to becoming a expert in Norse mythology. We often forget that he was one of the world-leading experts on the mythology of the Norwegian people, of the Vikings. And he admits that part of doing this, why he did this, was because he wanted to recapture that feeling that he had felt. When he was a young man, he had this feeling of contentment, and then it faded, and he chased it. And he wanted to find that feeling of contentment.
Did he find it again?
Well, he does, but not the thing itself. And we'll talk about Lewis's conclusions about this in a little bit. Different poets in the Romantic movement, especially the British poets, write about this. William Wordsworth Wordsworth and Keats are kind of the two poets that we associate with this feeling. Wordsworth, in his famous poem Tintern Abbey, when he was a young man, he went on a walking tour of the Lake District of England by himself, and he sat on this hill, and he overlooked this beautiful pastoral scene. And in it, he saw this ruined church called Tintern Abbey, and this little house that had smoke rising from a chimney. And as he just sat there, he had this feeling of all in all, was sort of what he describes. He had this feeling of everything, that his heart longed to stay and live and just drink deeply of nature. And then the moment passed, and William Wordsworth was sort of animated by this passion and this feeling, and he went back to the city, went back to his life, and he just was haunted with this idea. And next, he got another opportunity to go back to the Lake District and go to Tintern Abbey. And he went up to the hill and he sat down, and it was the same kind of day. And he was like, "All right, like, hit me." Wait, and he just sat there looking at the church, waiting for the feeling to come back. And then nothing. Yeah. And he didn't have it. And he was tremendously distraught. This thing that he had built up thinking he would have, this experience he would have, he didn't have it. And so he decided, to make a long story short, that he would try to crystallize the feeling in his poetry. If he could just write about it, if he could just try to capture what that feeling was in his poetry perfectly, then he could have it. He could, put lightning in a jar. He could have it in words. He could go back. He could experience it. And he never really does. And so Wordsworth, the young man poet, is longing and haunted by this experience of beauty and trying to get it back and really wanting it. And then Wordsworth, the old man, I think he becomes like a crotchety conservative member of parliament, right? Like he just sort of, he becomes kind of this grouchy, crusty British guy. Mm-hmm. But he had these feelings of desiring to have this feeling flood back to him, and he never gets it. And another poem that he writes, Intimations of Immortality, he talks about like when we were born, we are these like little bundles that just love experiencing the world of nature, and then as we get older, the world kind of drains us of this, and we lose it, and we sort of and there's sort of this idea that almost like this negative view of maturity, that the older you get, the sort of worse you get, and everything was better when you were young.
Do you agree with that?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay, good.
I think that it's possible. Chesterton writes about this, that as we grow, like when we're young, we have this idea of magic. And as we grow, we think about magic. But what we forget is that the world is a magical place. Because we have seen rivers doing the things that rivers do and plants doing the things that plants do, we forget that it is insane magic that we can put a small bean in the ground and a plant comes out of the ground after attaching and then eats sunlight and gives us food. Like that is insanity. And it is only by the dullness of repetition that we have forgotten that the world is completely filled with magic. And when we say things like, he does this by instinct, instinct is a word meaning we have no idea how they do this thing, right? Birds fly south on instinct, which means we have no idea how birds fly south. They just keep on doing it, and we don't understand how.
So we call it instinct.
So we call it instinct.
Yeah.
Right. When really it's kind of magic.
Yeah. So I think for a lot of the conclusions that the Romantic poets make about human nature and human life, I do take issue with, and I think they're kind of wrong.
Yeah.
But they do see a problem that their world presented to them. And as we said, the Romanticism grew out of this world that had become very formulaic, very scientific. In our English class, we have a catechism that I make the kids say the beginning of every single class. It takes about 6 minutes. It started off taking 8, but now they're pretty good at it. It takes 6. And when we talk about Romanticism, we say that it is a reactionary movement to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began to reduce man to merely a thinking thing. The Romantics remind us that man is not a thinking thing, but a thing that loves. So that to me sort of crystallizes what the Romantic movement did. It kind of reminded us that human beings are not just machines in bodies, which the Enlightenment had kind of reduced us to, but that we are feeling things as well. The problem with the Romantics is that they took that feeling thing as either the only thing, or they sort of took it too far and said that man was just a wild animal that just reacted on instincts. And that's wrong. Anyway, but this feeling of deep joy, to sort of trace what Lewis does with it. So most of the Romantic poets have this feeling. So Wordsworth could never get it back. He could never write poetry that gave it to him. And he kind of ends up being sad as he gets older. There are some tragedies that happen in his life. He has some children who pass away early. He sort of has these poems, one of his poems, elegiac stanzas, where he really kind of seems to be saying goodbye to deep joy, like goodbye to that feeling, I'm never going to get you back. The world is too painful for the beauty of nature to penetrate, kind of thing. And then there are different poets who are Romantic poets who talk about this, but like Coleridge, Wordsworth's friend, Coleridge is a poet who, when he talks about the passions of nature and sort of the betrayal of you feel this thing, but then it fades away, he kind of gets angry with it. And he tries to fill that void with other things, and he actually ends up becoming a drug addict, an opium addict. Students easily and quickly ascribe to Coleridge like punk rock status in my class because he's following that same kind of trajectory. There's wild, passionate intensity. He wants to drink deep of life. The things that he felt when he was young, he's losing those feelings as he gets older, and he tries to fill that void with something. Yeah. In his case, it's substances, and he becomes sort of this sort of washed out old dude. Or no, he doesn't. He washed out, sort of shell of himself. Keats, who talks about these wild, passionate feelings coming from nature and art. For Keats, deep joy came to him through art. Dies really young. And so I tell my students he kind of died before he got sad. So he was kind of like in the throes of wild, passionate, romantic youth, and then he died. So he never got the chance to sort of write the poems about how nature betrayed him, like how Wordsworth does. And then I sort of controversially add William Butler Yeats into our Romanticism unit, even though he's about 70 years later. But I think he deserves to be fit in as one of these sort of last Romantic poets of the modern age. Anyway, we don't need to talk about Yeats. There's a whole other podcast on him because I love him.
Yeats!
Yeats!
Sorry.
But so all of these Romantic poets, their relationship with deep joy and Romanticism is that they felt this, their hearts resonated with it, And to their credit, they kind of dedicated their lives to try to get it back. They became poets. They became people who were chasing after the feeling. I don't know enough about Romanticism in music to know if this is true of a Beethoven who is in that era, of dedicating your life to try to get this feeling back. But it is definitely true in the arts, and it is definitely true in poetry. These men and women who dedicated their lives to try to conjure this feeling back. It's like you see a beautiful animal and it runs away, and now you're trying your best to coax it out of the woods again, and it's not coming. Lewis had the same trajectory, and he felt it, and he too dedicated his life to try to get this feeling back. He began to study the books and literature through which he felt this. He wanted to write his own stories. He wanted to be a creative force that could write his own stories to get this back. But he never did. Or he didn't until his conversion. He was sort of frustrated at this. But instead of just falling into sadness like a Wordsworth, he asked himself the question, it bothered his reason, because he said, there is a human phenomena that these poets write about, that I myself have experienced, where my heart, for a moment, desired more than the world had. And then it faded and I didn't have it. Either I just had this psychedelic experience that is meaningless, but he didn't like that solution, or my heart wants more than the world can offer it. And if that is true, then I am made for a different play. I am made for something more than just this world.
You're talking about The Weight of Glory.
That's
here.
right. Now, C.S. Lewis himself, this did not make him a Christian. This didn't even make him a theist. But this was the first step on his conversion, was that he said, there is a hunger in my soul that is not satisfied by anything that I have found on earth. My soul must be made for something beyond earth, beyond the world. And he began to think of this world as like a shadowlands, that this world is like a turned down version of what it should be.
And isn't that reflected in a lot of Eastern religions?
Yeah, it
right?
is.
That the world is an illusion,
Yeah.
or that it's not as it should be. And
the reason why it's reflected in those religions is because they're people too, right?
yeah,
And they've
exactly.
had
They
this
have the same
experience.
experience. Yeah.
And but the answer does not come with, well, keep looking.
Yeah.
But for Lewis, the answer came with the idea that the world has fallen. And those little moments of deep joy is like the heart getting to return to prelapsarian Eden for a second, to remind you that you want something more. And so for Lewis, began. So in comes Tolkien, his good friend and sort of a good Catholic man, comes in and begins to talk to Lewis about the fact that this is the soul's desire for heaven, and then and that Christ is myth-made history. And
because C.S. Lewis says, isn't Jesus Christ just a myth like any other myth? And he says, maybe we have myths, but one of them is true, right? One is an archetype that all other myths are trying to reach for, and Jesus is this myth, real myth. And that kind of blows Lewis's mind.
Lewis's conversion is not just one from deep joy. It was almost the emotion or the feeling or the experience that got him wanting something spiritually deeper than just what the world had to offer. And then he had all sorts of other questions that had to be answered that don't really pertain to Romanticism. But that is what we talk about in our 10th grade English class when we talk about Romanticism, that the human person has this capacity and these experiences of beauty that ignite the heart, wanting it, causing it to desire more, and that the world is not a satisfactory place. And those who, anyway, so I tell my students that, like, there is only one, if you follow that desire honestly, there's only one place that it will lead you to, and that is God. But everybody else, but most people, like, don't follow that honestly. They think it's from something else. And so
They think that
follow
the
that.
medium is the
Yes.
source.
Yeah. So,
So they worship the medium. Like they feel it through a sunset, so they watch sunset every night, and,
and
they don't get
doesn't
it
come
back.
back.
Yeah.
So
Same with nature, same with women, same with whatever you feel it through.
So I tell in the Catechism, I say, what is the error of the Romantics? And what they say is, if I can remember it, the Romantics misplaced their affections. The soul's deep, joyful resonance with nature was designed to point ourselves back to its God, our source. They fell in love with the means as opposed to the end. So they fell in love. So
It's
Lewis,
the error of polytheism, right? Or pantheism. They put the God in the nature rather than...
Yeah, so Lewis says that nature is a signpost pointing to God. And what he means is not just the intricacy of its creation, which is true, but also our experience of the world both excites us and dissatisfies us. And that excitement and dissatisfaction points our souls to God, what we actually want and what we were actually made for. And in many ways, the following after our own desires in this world is an attempt to fill that void that we have felt with other things. So we, in our Romanticism unit, we read Byron, because Lord Byron is somebody that tried to fill that void with women. And sort of like the life of a rover and women in parties. And then he got to the point where it wasn't fulfilling him anymore. And so he decides to go die gloriously in war. And he does. And all the women of Europe mourn his death. And then Coleridge, who tries to fill that void with drugs. And yes, these are I am kind of oversimplifying these men's lives for the students to talk about this point. But I don't think it's a completely unfair simplification. Coleridge did do drugs because he was sad. Wordsworth does get grouchy because he doesn't have joy anymore.
The women do love Byron.
The women love Byron, and Byron kind of goes off. Lewis finds God. William Butler Yeats realizes at the end of his life that he wants to sing these songs of deep joy in heaven, if we to read the Sailing to Byzantium. So,
and I think C.S. Lewis would say that once he had found the true source of this beauty, then it probably infused all of the other things that he did, right? Instead of trying to pull the beauty out of ancient literature, he could read ancient literature knowing whence the beauty came and experience it maybe a little more.
Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and these things will be added unto you. But the opposite is if you seek these added things, you'll miss them and the kingdom of God, right? And so I think, so Lewis definitely, later in his life, he says that when he realized that Christ was what he wanted, and Christ is who he's got, that does animate and recast all of these books. And so it is no longer a search of a starving man. It is somebody who can go back and can read these things with delight and joy, being on the inside of the story as opposed on the outside trying to get inside.
So,
does that make sense?
Couple of questions.
Yes.
First, maybe not a couple of questions, but one question. When was your experience?
So
what was yours?
So Lewis, when he talks about this, he even says, I am embarrassed to even write this down because...
I'm hinting at a thing that we've all experienced and can't be put into words?
But also, to young Lewis, having that little toy was this moment of beauty and desire. And if you said, but dude, it's just a mason jar with moss in it, it would hurt. It would wound him because it's true. It is just a mason jar with moss. But it's also, you still don't understand me, man. Right? So I even shudder to put into words my experience of it. But I had an experience of it when I was about 18 or 19 at camp. And I worked for 8 summers at Northland Bible Camp. Woo! And it was 10 hours away from Toronto, so I didn't go home on the weekends. So oftentimes I was at camp by myself or with other people on the weekend, and there's no campers. And I think it was a Friday night, and all the campers had left, and I had done a day's work, and so I was tired, and it had been a hot day. And I laid in bed with the window open, because it's a little wood cabin, no air conditioning. I just lay in bed with the window open, and then it started to rain. And you had the sound of the rain on the wooden roof, and then you had that smell of wet forest. So this cool air of wet green forest smell blew in the window. And then the cabin was sort of on top of this hill, and down in the bottom was the lake. And in the distance of this rainstorm, I heard the call of a loon. We don't have loons in Texas, but if you Google loon call, it's sort of this sad, warbly bird, almost like a sort of a mournful cry. And as I was laying there, I heard this loon and the rain and the smell, and I just had that moment where I was just so, like AJ, almost what you were talking about last podcast, like just happy to be alive, or we were talking about with the Ray Bradbury.
Cares and vanity are stripped away. And I was actually
Yeah.
thinking that might be one of the reasons it's easier when you're young. The
Exactly,
world is full of hope, full of future. Anything could happen.
Yeah.
You maybe haven't developed the same
Jadedness or
jaded
whatever.
complexes that you deal with when you're an adult, the same vanities, the same knowledge of, and maybe just the repetition hasn't beaten your sense of joy out of you.
But you're older enough that it's not just like, I flippin' love ice cream.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's
Candy tastes so good.
yeah, it's so you have so that's why it sort of hits you in your youth. And I just had that moment, and then like a mosquito buzzes in your ear, and it's gone, and then whatever.
Yeah.
But I've laid in bed and I've had rainstorms and I've heard birds before, and it never comes back. And I didn't put too. I sort of thought about it, and I was just like, man, I love camp. Is the thought that I had.
Yeah.
And then in my mind, I was like, if I could just live at camp my entire life, I would be happy. And I was even planning my life. I'm going to take over camp. I'm going to live in Northern Ontario, take over camp, because that's where I'm happy. And then in college, I was reading Romanticism and really was reading Lewis, and I was like, oh man, I can't be happy at camp. I mean, I can, but not in the way that I think I want to be.
Because if you start working at camp, you realize that you have to figure out the food budget.
Exactly.
And you have
And
to
then
deal with
it's-
kids with problems, and you have to deal with counselors who don't obey the rules, and you have to...
And it's not that camp that I wanted, it's that moment.
Yeah.
And so reading Lewis, and then I myself was convinced by his argument that it is the desire for heaven that you have. And then, which is tremendously freeing, because I don't have to...
You don't have to be at that camp.
I don't have to be at that camp. I'm with Christ everywhere, right? Anywhere. So, but that was that moment there. And it's kind of, I even tell it to the class. And every year there are kids who are like, that's stupid, I don't feel stuff. And then every year there's like a couple of kids, and I can just see it in their eyes. They're like, they even come up and they're sheepish. They're like, Donaldson, I know exactly what you're talking about. I had one student last year who was embarrassed. She said, Donaldson, I had that experience in a Randall's parking lot. And I was like, that's awesome. Yeah. But I tell my students, yeah, okay, fine. You say you don't have it, it'll hit you one day. And I had a student a number of years ago who was like, that's stupid, I don't feel things. And then he came back as a junior, and it was during like the parent-teacher welcome day, where like the new 10th graders sort of shyly come in. They're like, I'm in your class now. And you're like, cool. And you shake their hands. He burst in the doors, and he's like, Donaldson. And he got kind of sheepish. He's like, I felt deep joy. I was like, yeah, you did.
So good.
And he's like, I was in my hammock, and I was looking at the sky, and like a cicada started buzzing, and I just had that, and he was describing it, and he was getting embarrassed. I was like, I told you, man. I told you. Anyway, so yes, that is his experience. What about you, Berg, Hannemer?
I've had a few, and I remember two really vividly. One was at a lake in Canada, and I was sitting there, and the lake was beautiful,
of course
and
it
the
was.
day was perfect, and I was like, man, nature is beautiful. And I felt this strange eternity creep up on me. Like this moment can stretch forever. It was odd. It was deep joy. And I've had the same thing, and this is going to sound really funny, but in high school when I was driving my old 79 Ford Fairmont, it was this boxy, flesh-colored nightmare of a vehicle that the exhaust pipe was rusted through, and it would shoot exhaust straight into the cabin. I had no idea, but I just knew I got headaches and a little dizzy. At any given moment, 3 of the 6 cylinders were like clogged with oil because oil leaked into the spark plugs. Like, it was a bad car, but it was my car. And I had the windows down, and it was sunny, and I was driving next to a golf course, and it was just, my cares fell away.
Yep.
And if I'm honest, I had a little bit of that feeling at the beginning of this podcast when you started talking about it.
Yeah, you did.
I don't know if it was a complete deep joy, but I'm sitting here. It's beautiful outside. I'm with my friends. I'm not worrying about the things that I have to do.
Right.
And weirdly, I think many of God's commands are aimed at returning us to this experience.
Yes.
Right? Do not worry about tomorrow.
Tomorrow has
The care,
today
its
has
own
enough
cares,
cares.
right? Today has enough cares, and He is trying to help us to divest ourselves of the vanity and self-concern and
Anxiety.
worry and anxiety and all of these things that can steal that joy and return us to a joy, and we can never keep it because we can never be totally sinless, right? But I think that he is trying to get us back to that place. I think I've said this in the podcast before, I never understood how the psalmist could say, I love your commands, right? Especially because the commands in the Old Testament don't seem lovable.
Life-giving, yeah, sure.
But I get it now. And I only got it, I think, at 31, when I was like, he is trying to make us free, right? That is the goal of every command in Scripture. He is trying to give us freedom and beauty, especially freedom from ourselves. And the more I try to embrace that, the more I feel deep joy. And I wanted to bring up one other student who came up to me and told me when she had experienced deep joy. Every year, my house puts on a dance.
The stag dance?
And it's electronic music, and it's a lot of lights, and it's goofy, and I just play like bad electronic music, like 4 on the floor, that kind of thing. And I think I was playing Deadmau5's Strobe, like a version of it. And I remember seeing her do this, but she was standing in front of the speaker and just, I had 2 subwoofers and a speaker, and she was just standing in front of it. And I just saw her like go inside herself and start staring into oblivion and like bend over and just open her hands and receive the music,
awesome.
receive the Deadmau5, and I could just watch her mind being like blown wide open. And she came after, and she's like, I had it. I had deep joy. Thank you, Mr. Hannenberg. And I was like, all I was doing was pressing buttons, but
It's really cool.
it can come anywhere. And
Yeah.
so shout out to that girl if she's listening.
What about you, Bees?
I've asked you for this. I've wanted to learn about deep joy for a long time, and you said no. Wait for the podcast, and so then here I am.
Well, it's you have to be clear. I'm not a cruel person. It was, can I sit in on your deep joy
It was
lecture in
that.
class? And I said
No,
no
because
your presence would. Any other person's presence in an English class changes
the class.
the atmosphere of an English
Which
class.
we know because you let me come to another one of your classes, and then it changed the discussion in that class. So sorry about that. Yes, my first reaction to it was when I was saved, and I was at a camp, but it wasn't related to nature. Is that important to the deep joy?
Historical.
Was it related to Deadmau5?
Yeah, it was in fact.
So
yeah,
in
I repented of listening to Deadmau5. Is what I'm trying. I'm just
in
joking.
usual romanticism, it's either nature, art, music. Those tend to be the
Music,
3 things.
yeah.
And I'm going to end the podcast by some words of warning of what it isn't, because there's lots of students that get confused about other things. Anyway, but
Sorry. So the one I was, I went to it was a camp for incoming freshmen going to the University of Texas at Austin. It's called Ignite. If you know anyone going, it's ignitetexas.org. Please sign up. And so,
And it's not a convention for arsonists.
it is not, though. That would be much more fun. We do have funny fire related stories, but I can't share those on a podcast. My first experience of sorrow over my sin, repentance over that sin, and then there was a worship service right after that it was all of us incoming freshmen coming together, and it was just like, I don't know, it was the most freeing, like outside of time, like I don't know, it was just really powerful. That was the first one that came to mind. But then when you talked about nature, I was thinking about when I got married, Sarah and I went for our honeymoon, went to Costa Rica, and I was in charge of some of the scheduling, and I was really bad at it. And so I scheduled us to be this entire day in this little surf town called Tamarindo. And like, this was a horrible idea because there's like 3 things to do in Tamarindo, and like none of them require the entire day. And so, 30 minutes into our 8-hour day, it's like, oh no, we have all this time to fill. And so we're walking around, and I'm kind of grouchy because it's my fault that I planned really poorly. But we found this little restaurant that had seats on the beach, and they served us guanabana, which is this delicious like fruit, just like a fruit smoothie. And we just like sat on the beach, and like, I don't know, like it suddenly no longer mattered how much time that there was left there, and we were just like outside of that, and it was the 2 of us together, and I don't know.
yeah.
I remember another one I had at swimming in the Red Sea in Israel. Like it was a crazy, crazy trip, and they had our time booked solid. And I think we actually had to refuse to go do some other activity. Everybody was going scuba diving, and we decided not to, but to go down to the beach and swim in the Red Sea. And I remember it was just peaceful.
Yeah.
It was really nice.
Yeah, so what we do, there are some words of caution that I give to my students because there are some things that this isn't. A lot of students say, oh, it's like falling in love. But falling in love with another person is not the same thing as deep joy. That's a different kind of emotional response altogether. This romantic deep joy that we're talking about is a means. I'm even convinced that God has created it into the fabric of creation as a means to an end, that another avenue for the soul to know that it wants to get to God is having the experience of transcendentalism in beauty. And so deep joy is a means to an end, which is God. A human person is never a means to an end. Like the relationship that you have in falling in love is not you don't fall in love because it's your soul's satisfaction. I mean, it's a different thing. Loving somebody else is not the same thing as deep joy. So I caution my students with that. The other thing is, and I was even thinking about this when you were talking about the student who was having the experience at the dance party. Knowing that student was not on illegal or illicit substances.
No.
But for this experience of beauty is and having the feeling of beauty fade away and then a desire to fill that void does mean that like the romantic heart is one that is more predominantly predisposed to wanting to fill it with substances. I mean, we talk about the punk rocker or the rock and roller who, lives a life of debauchery and substance abuse. And a lot of that is because of this feeling of beauty and that they must have had that moment on the stage where they felt alive and then they don't feel it again. And then they sort of numb that pain or that sort of angst or the desire for it. Another word of warning is that this is also ripe for idolatry. And you were hinting at it with pantheism and polytheism, that you begin to worship nature. C.S. Lewis called the Romantic poets that they worshipped a spilled religion, that they began to worship nature and deep joy as itself a god, and that they were sad that God had rejected them, and they needed to do something to get it back, a sacrifice, perfect living, some kind of thing to get the feeling of deep joy back, when in reality, it was not a god. It was almost like a force or somebody pointing the soul's desires back to God, its source.
A magnetism.
Yeah, or even Lewis, I think, when he's doing Narnia and he has like the dryads and naiads and these sort of river gods and wood gods and all worshiping Aslan. And some of the kids can find Aslan because they're drawn to the beauty of the nymphs that take them to Aslan, where everyone's sort of anyway. So those are just sort of some words of caution. How Romanticism sort of played itself out in history is also kind of like a misunderstanding of human nature. These are the conclusions that they drew. Oh, I want nature itself. As opposed to God. And sort of one of the hangovers or the carryovers that we have of Romanticism in the modern world is this strong emphasis on your own individual experience. Your own individual experience that supersedes like common humanity. And the idea that the happy person is the genius. The person from whom they can give voice to their own inner experience in order to make deep joy exist. And I never realized this until I had sort of gone through Romanticism. I did my master's degree in C.S. Lewis's book, Till We Have Faces, which is one big story about how the soul has dealt with deep joy and how it finds God at the end. That's a whole other podcast. But anyway, and it wasn't until I went back and I read in the classical world. In the classical world, you often get philosophers and writers talking about the seductive dangers of poetry. And I think what they mean is that writing poetry and just sort of living in the world of beauty divorced from reason or divorced from philosophy can be just like a sticky, sweet covering over our soul's desire for God. Now, they wouldn't have framed it in our soul's desire for God, but it can be like a seductive force that numbs us to the work of soul betterment. And so we can get lost in the sort of the sad songs of the poets, and not have the sort of sober-minded, clear thinking of the philosophers that is also needed. Like Lewis needed both. He needed the experience of beauty, but then he also needed his questions about God answered satisfactorily. And he got that when he talked to Tolkien. And I think every soul needs to have, like, the soul's conversion needs to be both of those things. It needs to have the desire for God that is felt in the heart, but it also needs to have the settled questions of the mind as well. And if only one happens, if only your brain is baptized, but your heart is not, then you are just going to know the right answers but not care. If only your heart is baptized, but your brain is not, it's like the seed that sprouts up quickly but has no root, and then when the sun scorches it, it melts away. I think that's true. Sort of, if it's just a emotional conversion and not a soul's conversion, you have this kind of problem. Anyway, so Romanticism. So even though I wax poetically about it, and I find it very fascinating, the more I've taught it, the more I've thought about it, the more I realize that it is halfway there, and it is not the entire story of the soul's experience and then the soul's sort of reality. It's kind of this dangerous thing, right? Like, I realize this as I teach this to students. Like, I am giving language and voice to an experience that they've had, which is good. I want them to know that what their heart is longing for is relationship with Christ, which is true. Not all students buy it yet. And I know that, that can get, because you see that playing out in people's lives, is that they have their souls awakened to hunger and desire, and then they go off searching for the fulfillment of that desire. And they can go off in all sorts of different wrong directions. I struggle sometimes with thinking, is it better just to keep them numb and not thinking about it? Or
I think it's better to warn them that where it's coming from.
Exactly.
Otherwise, they're going to feel it and follow whatever.
And you do, and I do. Whether or not that advice is always heeded, of course. Right. I mean, this is, I want to have control over their lives, which I don't. And faith is a long journey, and you hope that they get there eventually. But it is a little bit of the dangers of education, which is you are increasing their potential, which could also be a bad thing.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. We should draw this to a close.
Yeah. I know what I want you to read.
I'm gonna read it. So Donaldson and I have had long discussions about whether poetry is a good thing or not. There are certain poets that I like, and I can recognize really good poetry. I land on the side that poetry is, and I'm landing on the same side that Plato landed on, by the way. That poetry is dangerous, and I think the ease of entry into the art form means that there is far more bad poetry out there than good, and it's easier to write than a long novel. It takes less work, which means a lot of amateur writers make really bad poetry. But
I don't disagree with that.
Yeah, and it's prevalent. There's a lot of bad. There is some good stuff. I can recommend good poets, but there's a lot of bad too. And I was going to read this about. It's from Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, which we've been said we were going to tackle, and I've been trying to read. So far, it's pretty good. And he is in jail, and he's talking to Wisdom, the goddess. They're having a conversation. She shows up, and he's kind of spaced out for a while, and then she kind of tries to snap him out of it. And as she approaches, this is kind of what she says. As she caught sight of the muses of poetry standing by my bed, giving me words to suit my tearful mood, the lady was angry for a moment, and her eyes flashed with savage fire. She spoke. Who let these whorish stage girls come to see a sick man? It's more pain they bring than remedies. No, they make things worse with their sweet-tasting poison. These are the kind of women that choke off a mind's rich fruit, wrapping it up in sterile thorns of passion. They make a mind more used to disease instead of setting it free from pain. If you were trying to seduce a common man with your enticements, as you usually do, it wouldn't bother me so much. But then you would not be damaging my work.
That's good. I mean, because if you just left students thinking that the intensity of feeling is an end, then you get stupid things like the ending of Dead Poets Society, where they're all standing on their desks, with their romantic feelings to their teacher or whatever. Romance in terms of deep feeling, right? Like if deep feeling is an end, then I think the person who thinks that just deep feeling is an end is someone who is in despair. And I think that's what philosophy is telling Boethius here, that like you are in a dark place, you're in a dungeon, and you're trying to console yourself with sweet music and poetry. That's not going to do it. That's the wrong medicine.
Well, and even they were suiting his mood. So he was depressed. He was reading depressed poetry. And our students do the same thing. Yes. When you are feeling bad, you listen to sad, depressing music. Right. And that isn't healthful. That's not a remedy.
It feels like somewhat of a consolation, a wallowing, a sinking down into this thing, a burrowing into their sort of like sad blankets of comfort. But it's not.
It's not. And I think even after listening to a bunch of artists talk about I listened to a podcast called Song Exploder, where artists talk about the way they make music. And one of the things they talk about is having to feel things more extremely and sort of wallow in that feeling. But almost ubiquitously, it's a bad experience. Yeah, right. It damages them, right? They have to feel pain and continuously feel pain to try to make their music. And I don't think that's helpful for the human person. Just like if you just went through a breakup, listening to breakup songs is not good for you. And this is the temptation of poetry. And I think now the temptation of music and of movies is to wallow, right? I had just broken up with a girl in college, and we were on a road trip, and I got sick, and so I stayed back and watched Love Actually.
Oh, dude.
Oh, man.
Man, if you're looking for a way to just straight up bum yourself out, that's the way to go. That is a way to do it. Oof.
So my solution is always like, if you're feeling the desire, the lack, if you're feeling that haunting of deep joy, like make your bed, make yourself some eggs, go for a walk, do something physical, read a great book, hang out with friends, like live the good life, as opposed to sort of just wallow in the...
Yeah, don't go seek poetry. And if you're feeling bad, maybe listening to sad music isn't the way to solve yourself, or even trying to force yourself to listen to happy music because it doesn't apply, right? Practice philosophy. Remind yourself that time heals wounds. Remind yourself that wallowing in an emotion is probably not a healthful thing to do. And go ride a bike, take a walk, do something useful, have a conversation with a friend, right? This is practicing philosophy, and it's more helpful to the soul than maybe wallowing in poetry.
And if your soul is in that wallowing place, like it wants relationship with God. And that's what it wants. And so, so take internal stock of your own soul to see if you are far from him. And prayer always helps. Because the consolation that comes through the poets is a false one. Yeah. Anyway,
okay, that's good. Let's drawing it to a close. This has been. Oh, you opened, right? So you got to close.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to steal
your
thunder.
Fine. This has been Classical Stuff. Thank you everyone for listening. Hey, if you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. That would mean a lot to us. If you have any ideas for topics, anything you want to send us, classicalstuff@veritasacademy.net. We're on Twitter at CLSSCAL stuff. At Classical Stuff.
And Twitter is just a hotbed of deep joy. No, I was kidding.
Is it? No. Isn't it literally the exact opposite? It's miserable. I have a personal Twitter. I never use it. It just makes me sad. I think that's everything. So thank you all for joining us, and we will talk with you again soon.
Cool.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.